emulated, or some degree of replication happening to the work you're putting out. And we wanted to share some perspective on that, some experiences on that, and just some strategies also for figuring out how to deal with it. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. And I wanted to start with a quote. If you're upset about being copied, you're not moving fast enough. Me. Actually, no, wasn't me who said that. I stole that. It's a guy called Tim Solo on Medium, and makes a great point. This idea of if the market is able to copy what you're doing, then you have time to worry about it, then you're not moving fast enough to be worrying about the next thing that somebody else is going to copy. So the first idea is really about speed, and this idea that if someone is able to copy you and you have time to get upset about it, then kind of have your blinders facing the wrong way. One way to think about it. Another way to think about it, this guy, designer, said, don't worry about stealing your design work, but we can leave the word design out of this for a second. Don't worry about people stealing your work, worry about the day they stop. So this is one of the bigger themes in the presentation, which is really about just understanding market forces and what it really means for somebody or a company to start emulating what you're doing. It's really just a signal that you've found something that works and that's resonating with people. And a bigger signal and a more worrying thing to concern yourself with is either nobody picking it up in the first place, or people stopping from emulating what you're doing. So really, it's just a signal that is indicating that something you're doing has some sort of resonance. So another way to reframe the way you think about your work being emulated. This is a quote that was dropped in a thread in the Slack group the other day that was a specific example of like a clone of some work. So this is a guy called Hugh MacLeod, and he's done these drawings for, I think, 10, 20 years at this point, but he does them on the back of business cards or napkins or whatever else. And I won't read this verbatim, but you can grab this in the replay or go in the Slack and find this quote. But essentially he's saying, the only way somebody's going to surpass what I'm doing is if they do more of it than me, better than I'm doing it. And essentially for somebody to overtake me, they've got a grueling number of years ahead of them. And if they're doing it for the wrong reasons, then it's really going to suck. And quite honestly, we've seen this happen a few times. Someone could kind of focus on emulating the outcome that you've produced or the output, but if they don't have that drive or that series of inputs or that combination of experiences that creates the output, then really they're always one step behind you. So great perspective from somebody that's been doing something for a very long time, been very successful at it. And there's another part of this discussion that I think even isn't being touched on in this quote here. So what people typically emulate is, iceberg principle. It's the stuff that's out in the market. It's the product of your experience, your work, et cetera, et cetera. And we're all human to the degree where we take offense to someone emulating what we're doing, or we worry about it disqualifying the rest of our experience, or making us think that, all of this time we've put in has now been completely eradicated by this person copying the final frame of the movie, as it were. But how I like to think about it is, the reason you can create these things and you can come up with this original output in the first place is because you're harnessing all of the unique inputs in the bottom of the iceberg. So somebody's always a step behind you, essentially, in this process. So the strategy of taking something verbatim is just a terrible strategy, because the person you're taking it from is always one step ahead of you. And if you want to simplify that even further, it's like you can copy the output, but you can't really copy the input. It's the things that you're doing off camera, off, social network X, off publishing platform X, that are the inputs that create that specific and unique output. So the more energy and effort you focus on your inputs, your outputs will get better. And the very notion of somebody copying an output is validation that what you're doing is resonating with people. So let's keep going. To sum that idea up, it's often like the form factor or the little things that are like and this is a hammer nail comment, like the visual components of something are very easy to copy, the stylistic things, but the substance is something that plays out over time. So if you say you've published 400 pieces of work, someone comes along and publishes one piece of work that emulates the style of work you've been doing, there's still 399 pieces of work away from getting to where you're at. And there's also not that substance driving what they're doing. It's really the only input is the thing that they've looked at something and they've like made a carbon copy of it. There's no driving force beneath that that's going to keep them on that path of producing with substance. It's just a bad strategy. So we noticed this happening over the last 6 months, 9 months or so. Like every day, maybe there's something that pops up on Instagram or on Twitter or somewhere that's like essentially a heavily influenced version of visualized value. And like the first time I saw it, I was like, man, this is frustrating. Like maybe somebody like overtakes us and all of this effort was for nothing. Hasn't happened yet. But then you start to think about what do you really mean by somebody overtaking you? It's not really like the world is such a massive place, and like the relationships that we've built up in creating that brand are so much more valuable than any other metric that we could possibly measure it by. But to sort of speak to that trend that was happening, it was like, how can we take advantage of the idea that people are like gravitating towards this and want to emulate it? So really just take this perspective of, you can get upset or you can get paid. So you can figure out a way to monetize this thing that people want to do, want to learn, want to emulate, or you can stew and, try and chase after everybody and stop them from doing it. So that's what we decided to do. Let's figure out a way to capitalize on the idea that people, want to do what we're doing. So we built the product, which most of you are probably familiar with, and that paid off handsomely over the last month, like 6 figures of sales from this thing. So use these inputs and the fact that people are giving you this signal to your advantage. And I think in any situation, there's something to be taken from this. Obviously, with what we're doing, there's a very direct translation to how to teach somebody how to do this, but it's an opportunity to further cement your position as a leader, not a threat in a lot of cases. Another way to think about it is if somebody is emulating your work, then your market is growing. So this whole idea of, visualized value, let's speak specifically about that as a discipline or a service or a way to articulate an idea. The more and more and more that's happening, the bigger the market grows. Even if the people we're not talking to directly are being exposed to that, we're still competing in that market, and people are essentially growing it for us. And as long as you stick to what you were doing originally, your size of that pie just increases with time. So if you think about the idea of a power law and how if you're, it's taken you X amount of time to get noticed to the point where people are going to copy what you're doing. Typically that's the case, right? You're not going to copy someone who's a week into something. You see an idea, it's been validated over 6 months. You see somebody's making a living from it. So you're like, I'm going to copy that thing. So essentially what happens here is you have all of these people kind of line up underneath it and try to emulate exactly what's happening. And as a function of their emulation and their participation in what you're doing, there's this relationship that exists between you and the market, them and the market, which just ends up propelling you even higher. So at the end of this situation, this is kind of what it looks like. You grow as a function of them drawing attention to the way you're communicating or the type of thing you're doing. And 90%, 95% of people, they realize it's going to take more than 2 weeks to do this thing. So they just completely drop out. So this is a massive oversimplification of how power law works. But the idea that the people that have established authority in a market, they keep going. The people that are like emulating that at the bottom end of the market are just growing the share of the market. And there's a correlation between how fast you go. If their work picks up, so does yours. So a pretty powerful example of this. And this is what we've seen to be true in what we've been doing. So I want to pull out an example just completely outside of this world. So the world of ride sharing, $70 billion of market cap, two massive companies, you both know who they are, and there's one massive winner, right? Uber's got $60 billion of that market share, and Lyft's got $10 billion. So the market itself, if it had just been Uber in market from day one, would the market be as big as it is now? I highly doubt it. There's like, you are capturing some of the effort of your competitors. They're growing the market for you. And then, you just out innovate them, build better product, and you end up with more of the pie. So this is essentially, I can't think of an example of an industry that's never had a competitor pop up when their idea has been validated. So, yeah, that's something to keep in mind when somebody's coming after what you're doing or emulating what you're doing. Since the recorded beginning of history, that's been the way things have grown and increased in adoption. So follow that thought up with this idea of, if somebody copies you and they manage to overtake you, then you deserve to lose. Like, we are participating in a market of ideas, and we expect to be rewarded for what we're doing. So if somebody comes and out executes us, then that aligns to that same belief system. They deserve to get paid for it, right? So regardless of the ethical components of it and all the subconscious, like how much of something really is a copy and what's coming from where, there's just the forces of the market that ultimately it comes down to who does it best, regardless of who does it first or second. One other point I wanted to add on to this entire narrative is, I know we've kind of been talking about like this, not a zero-sum game, but there's definitely like this level of competition that there's, a certain amount of dollars go a certain amount of places. But this idea of the more you align your business with yourself, or the more closely aligned what you're doing can't be replicated because it's tied to your identity, then the notion of competition, just the definition of that just completely changes. This is so much more relationship based, and you have so many more options in terms of, launching a project down the line, or pivoting to something else, or having a relationship with your customers that would be far more intimate than a brand name. So this is, I think, a pretty good insurance policy for everything we talked about, is just put your name on what you're doing, be transparent, operate with integrity, and you have an insurance policy for whatever you want to end up doing. Wanted to also talk about this idea that we often attribute this to like malicious. We think that somebody's being malicious if they copy what we're doing. And there's a great example of that this week. James Clear wrote this thing on Twitter, and I was like, oh man, it's a shame he didn't credit that. Like, I've been writing that for a while. And, but he's like, everybody's on Twitter absorbing the same information. They scroll past something, someone else like retweets something. I don't think a lot of this stuff is malicious. It's just sort of in the gray matter, and then it just sort of seeps out into different like creative expressions. And I don't know how this came about, but he ended up acknowledging it. And a lot of the time, the people that are emulating what you're doing, got a message just before this call, a lot of people that are emulating what you're doing are doing it because they saw you do it, and they have no intention to sort of degrade what you're doing. It's more of a tribute to, something that they respect about what you've done. So another point to bring up. And then the final point I wanted to bring up is this idea of, you can get so obsessed with chasing people that are coming after you and doing what you're doing, that you completely lose sight of the goal, right? And this idea of, if you've built a business around something that you truly believe in, then the idea of you spending more time attacking people that also believe what you believe is a crazy way to spend your time. So I don't know the intimate details of this story. I've just been told the anecdote a few times, but the Wright brothers essentially, pioneered spaceflight in the USA, and then consequently spent 10 years challenging patents and, getting into legal battles with people that are using technology that they supposedly had pioneered. And they spent so much time distracted from the actual goal that after 10 years, they're out of business, right? And the whole American airline industry suffers as a result of their lack of vision, or their lack of, like, I mean, it's selfishness in a way, right? It's just like, I'm more concerned about, how much of the pie I get than like this thing that I'm putting out into the world, versus, this different approach, which to date has proven to work. Tesla, all of their patents are out on, you can, if you want to start an electric car company, you can go and download the Tesla patent for an electric motor, and best of luck with it. Obviously change the trajectory of the industry, and now the biggest car maker in the US. So crazy difference in approach, and like, the end of the story is totally different, and it was completely determined. The trajectory was completely determined by their mindset and the way they thought about competition. Cool, that's the last slide. Let's go into some questions.
I think one thing too to talk about that you mentioned in the beginning is that it's really hard at first. Like, it takes time to not have the initial instinct or like little pain of seeing someone either, I think, take your colors, take the format, take all of it. Like, it's not a natural thing to be like, oh, good for them. It does take practice and time, but with time it gets a lot easier.
Yeah, I think it's like, it's hard to get over that barrier, but also in the early days, at least for me, it's like every time you see it, it was also like a really, really motivating thing. I know like that depends on a lot of people's personality, but if you see somebody's coming after you, it's just like a biological response for you to just go harder and like, just put more effort and energy into it and stay in front. So I think there's huge upside, obviously, to the opportunity of being able to build your business in public and share all this stuff instantly online. But there's also this, there's definitely risk. But I think most of that risk can be hedged by being being more transparent, right? And building it in your own name. And majority of the time, people will go to bat for you in defense of the fact that you can, the weird things, you can kind of tell when the intent is good and when the intent is bad. Like, people pick up on that even subconsciously, like when something is a tribute or like something influenced by something else versus a blatant ripoff that's trying to like make a short-term, like capitalize on something short-term, like cash grab. You can just feel it. We've got some questions here. Oh yeah, Craig. I don't know that story. I know George Lois, but I think that would be a great story to hear that. I'll answer these questions and we'll get you on, Craig. Brian says, can you talk about how you decided to be such a quick action taker? Yeah, I think as soon as I started to realize that you have a free feedback mechanism, I think that is the biggest influence on how fast you take action. Is so like there are very few businesses, at least that between us, we have the skill set to start, that would happen offline, right? Like, with no intention to start a restaurant or build an offline business or do whatever else. So I think the ability to get feedback in real time and try and be as like objective about the feedback you're getting as possible is a gift. The idea that you can, sit and think something up for a month and then go and put something out there and get, no reaction to it is like, trying to readjust your opinion of this thing being like, the internet being something that just helps you build faster, and like the longer you wait between iterations, I can't remember who said it this week, but it's like the faster, like a good indicator of how fast a company will grow is how fast it ships, and a good indicator of how fast it might die as well, which is a good thing too, right? The longer you wait between iterations, if you're on the wrong track, is going to hurt you as well. So in no like in no direction, I think action is a bad thing. If you're trying to validate an idea, it's just becomes common sense. And then I think, to be honest, you get addicted to the feedback loop. So it's easy for me to say this now when you can put stuff out to a massive audience and get feedback, but it's just that slow, when you slowly start to realize and even just wrap your head around the concept that you can reach 100 people, 200 people from your phone. This is when you have when we started out with a personal Facebook account or whatever, it's still way more powerful than sending emails to prospective clients or going through your Rolodex or doing whatever else. It's like, this ability to build in public and get feedback in real time for validating an idea and for just documenting your process. That to me is where just the bias for action comes from, is if something's a good idea or a bad idea before you spend hours and hours hypothesizing about it, or you can just put it out and get feedback. Yeah, Gallo, I think, so Gallo asked, I struggle with this because my visuals are exactly your style, but I wanted to share this approach with all things fitness, health related. So I said something on a call, I think last week, where it's like, and to speak to the principles in this document, it's like, we want people to become more confident visual communicators, right? Our business gets bigger, better, more effective, and our clients, hopefully stick around longer if they feel as though they're learning something. And if we're teaching the thing that we have, become competent at, that should grow our business. And yeah, for me, it may take a while to get there. I think a lot of people in this community are running online businesses, and the function of your business is to make somebody more competent at something. And we kind of weirdly have a tinge of if your job is a teacher and then your students become competent at what you're teaching, why are you getting upset? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's some weird primal jealousy, or what's the word? Not jealousy. It's just like some survival thing, right? Like somebody's overtaking my position in the hierarchy. And when you zoom out a little bit and you realize that, your mission all along was to empower people and get people moving and have people express ideas more creatively, then, you've done your job. It's not a threat. Brandon says, it seems easier to rationalize if you're the leader in the market. What if you're in a trailing position? Yeah. So I think the other way to look at this is, it's the degree of specificity in which you're operating as well. So I think we're the more specific you get, the easier it is to identify somebody supposedly copying what you're doing. So I think if what you're doing is fairly broad in terms of its definition, then so I'm thinking about your question in a different way. It's like you haven't created the market if you're asking that question. Does that make sense? If you're in a trailing position, then you are the person who is emulating something specifically, or you are you're identifying your position in a market, which means you're not at the level of specificity that we're talking about. Does that make sense, Brandon? I think that's definitely how we felt about it when we had a non-specific agency business, right? It's like, this agency does more revenue than we do. This agency has a cooler office than we do. They work with these different clients. It wasn't there wasn't enough specificity to even make a comparison. So I think that's a question of getting narrower on what you are delivering, or the service you provide, or the product that you're building. Do you have?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And there are a couple other layers to it. I think if you do feel that you are starting to get more niched down and specific, and it's not growing fast enough, some of it does just take time, and it can feel people it's not resonating at the speed that you want it to, but oftentimes it does take like refining your message, making sure you're speaking to the right people, and it takes time and consistency. But the other thing too is, and without knowing exactly what you're doing, it's hard to say, but I think an important theme across all of this is finding the thing that you enjoy doing most. So if you are in a trailing position in a market that is ill-defined or too big, or you're seeing growth and thinking that that's a smart way to start, I think it's not totally authentic to you or unique to you. And I'm not trying to project that that's the case, but just I think we've tried various things that feel like there's a lot of opportunity, and it's taken us time to find the thing that we're most excited and passionate about to get to this scale and gain this momentum. But it's one of the hardest things to do because it takes a lot of pivoting and like self-reflection, to be honest, that we spent 2 years building an agency thinking that was going to be our thing, and it just wasn't right for us. And that's where I think we always felt like we were in the trailing position. So it took a lot of like trial and error and honesty within ourselves to get to this new point and understanding.
Yeah, and I think like the other thing I would add is like the real like inflection point of people emulating what you're doing is when you see things happen. So whether that's like, that could be like financial returns, that could be like resonance on like a social platform. Like you figure out some tactic that works on Twitter, some way to format a tweet, some way to like, you know, the list thing that a lot of people do, or the way you construct a thread on Twitter. You figure out how to do that well, I guarantee you the next 2, 3, 4 days, you're going to see, you know, hundreds of that same thing happen. So it's like the order in which these things happen is typically like, until I started talking about this generating a certain amount of capital or interest or, you know, B2B opportunity for us, people aren't interested, right? So it's like this weird, like no man's land where it does require you to just be doing something because you like it for a certain amount of time, right? There's just that, like, if you're doing it because you like it, you don't really care if somebody else is, you know, is doing something kind of close to what you're doing, or it's just like a different motivation. It's you're doing it for a different reason. And this is like, this graphic I have up on the screen now is indicative of like, you know, this is what, 11 months, no revenue on this thing, nothing. And like, look back at, yeah, you get Instagram, like likes on your Instagram photos and blah, 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 but that's not really an indication of, you know, success. There's plenty of Instagram accounts with millions of followers that can barely pay their rent, right? It's like, as soon as this thing looks like a commercially viable thing, then people will try and copy it. And that's just how the market works, right? That's just how people pay attention to the, you know, the things that are resonating with customers. And then if somebody comes along and does it better than you, then you lose. But in a lot of cases, like, we're so specific at this point, and we have, I mean, this may be like an overly confident thing to say, but I don't think that we've been putting a specific point of view out there for such a long time that you've got enough of an audience, enough people bought into your message, enough people know what you're about, that regardless of what you decide to do, there are people that are coming on this journey with you. It's just, you build that audience by following something that you can do sustainably in the first place. I think that's why this competition thing, and like more specifically, you know, I'm not talking about anything I don't have experience in here. Like, people build businesses that are way less focused on their like personal, this is like content businesses or like inherently social businesses. There's a, you know, there are different forces at play in different markets. But speaking to our experience, like, if we weren't able to sustain this because we just were like, would do it for nothing, honestly, it's just like something that you can comfortably sustain. A lot of people come into the market and try and emulate what you're doing, but they do it because they see it's working, not because they want to do it. And just because something works for someone else doesn't mean you can emulate it and have the same success. And more often than not, the opposite happens, right? You try it and you realize that it's 20 times harder for you because you don't have some natural ability or inclination to pursue this thing.
Brandon, follow up with this one.
If Tesla ran with an idea of mine, they could reasonably run further if I was in the car space. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the idea that, like, I'm sure that happens at enterprise scale, and there's like corporate, what are we talking about here? Like corporate, what's the word I'm looking for? Espionage. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, I don't know the scale of your business, Brandon, but I think like a lot of people think about like problems at a scale that they're so far away from needing to be able to address that, like, you know, I don't know if anybody in here is making billions of dollars a year. I would imagine I would know if that was the case, but like this part of the journey that we're explaining, it's like us literally going from zero to revenue. And yeah, it's a like a niche subset of like digital businesses that a lot of these principles apply to. I do not have, honestly, the expertise to answer whether or not a like Tesla stealing an idea from an automaker. I have no idea how that works. I'm just speaking to what we have experienced.
I think we missed it.
We missed one?
Oh, maybe.
Tan. So Tan asks, I understand the right mindset is to focus on getting better at your craft, expressing idiosyncrasy rather than worrying about copycats. Do you have a recommendation for how to keep reinventing yourself and not settle into where you are? Do you already know now where you want to take VV next? Yeah, so one of the things I think, and you go back and watch a couple of the old office hours on this, one of the things was like just combining a bunch of interests and following curiosity to a certain degree. And one of the things that this whole journey like made us realize is the first business we had was more meticulously, like you would have to have more of a vision and a plan in that instance than we have now. So like the content first business has just allowed us to like make decisions on the fly almost. So the appetite for what we put out determines how we pivot in the future. So there's like, I would say we have like rolling like 6 or 12 month goals. Like initially we started out with a goal, you know, we don't want to do all these crazily different client projects that are completely like out of our wheelhouse. We have to like hire different types of talent, blah, blah, blah. So the first objective, you know, let's have, and this is like daily manifest principles. That's like the things that guided the development of that document is in 90 days, we want to be doing much less of this and much more of this. What do we have to do to get there? So visualized value became the vehicle to like try to create that transition. And then when that transition happened, it's like, okay, 90 days from here, now we're selling like PDFs for $19 and people are buying them. Maybe we could turn this into something big enough to be the thing, right? Be the like main source of income. So what do we need to do that? We either need to reach a exponential amount more people, or we need to develop a product that is, you know, at a higher price point so we can continue to scale, but without needing to like drastically increase the amount of people we're reaching. So that led us to the community. Oh, if people are using the daily manifest, what would be some sort of utility that we could add on top of that? Let's put the same people in the room, in a virtual room that are using this tool, and have them network with one another and share how they're using it, et cetera, et cetera. Then the next thing became, okay, now we're seeing people want to learn this skill of translating ideas to visual, translating or communicating ideas visually. Let's make a product to do that. And now what we're seeing is, you know, people want to build businesses around this idea of infinitely scalable digital products. So the next thing that we'll be thinking about building is helping people do that. So sharing everything we know about building and scaling a business that sells digital products. So it's like, it's a certain amount of like the, I think what guides a lot of the tactics is more of the time goals that we have. So we want to spend more time building products or less time answering client emails and on the phone with people that we don't necessarily want to be on the phone with. And then that just creates this urgency and like just a restriction that makes you design the business in a certain way. So just there's a certain degree of planning. I think there's value in 5 and 10 year plans and things of that nature, but ultimately I don't think that comes naturally to me personally as like the 10-year plan. It's more of the like, this is resonating. How can we keep responding to the positive feedback that we're getting from the market? And that's a luxury to like build a business that can do that versus, you know, being in a place where you have to put all of your eggs in one basket and forecast out 5, 10, 15 years and build the unicorn thing. I was having a conversation last week with somebody about this idea of, a lot of people think being an entrepreneur is building the next Facebook or building $1 billion business. And it's just like, I mean, it's just an absurd strategy, right? If you think about how many businesses actually scale to that size, you know, you could count them on your couple of hands in the last couple of years. So yes, it's like the goals are lifestyle driven, and then the direction of the business is feedback driven. Let me know if that helps, Tanner. There's a whole different like narrative there that we could explore more.
He said that was good.
Nice. Yeah, Alex, I think that, you know, I don't want to paint with like super broad brushstrokes and say that this is like the same problem for everybody. Like we are sharing what we have experienced for sure. And in like commodity businesses, like this is really brutal problem, right? It's like if you have a great email sequence and someone just rips it from you, then you're in trouble. Like there's no getting around some of that. The only way you can win is going back to that first quote, which is like, if people are copying you, and you're worried about it, it's because you're not moving fast enough, right? They're copying the thing that you have out. 30 days later, your next thing is out, right? So there's, I think regardless of the industry, that advice applies, but some of the stuff that we're talking about is more specific to like building a business around yourself. So there's like less risk in having, I say less risk. There's a different type of risk in like building a business that just relies on people liking what you're about versus like the specific features and of a commodity that you're building. So I don't know, there's some like things that we've been talking about, like the direction the market is going. Like it feels like there's this chasm opening up where you're going to have massive businesses, and then you're going to have like sole proprietors, creators, artists, you know, highly specialized talent. And then the middle ground is kind of getting wiped out right now. And accelerated by everything that's going on in the world at the moment. Jinson asks, how much of your skills for developing a digital product / marketplace can be transferred to a physical product? I think the fundamentals, there's a lot of similarities in there. Again, like without experience, wouldn't want to like call myself an expert in that space. But I think some of the like core tenets of like building a brand that people have a certain like affinity for, those principles all translate to physical product. I think the only real difference is in like the numbers and the complication of the distribution. So like we could have we have had a physical component to this business, selling books, selling prints, and everything stays the same. We just have to go to the post office and wrap stuff up. and, you know, deal with complaints from people whose books got lost at customs and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I wouldn't position the product as a solution for people building like D2C brands, like D2C physical product brands, because there probably are better solutions out there. And again, we're not trying to be everything to everybody. So that's, I think that would be my perspective on it. I think we're like, there's a lot at the principal layer that applies to any business you're building, but the nuances of like distributing a physical product and the tactics that work more specifically for that, we could definitely hook you up with people that know that world intimately well. Yeah, Brandon, that's a great question. So Brandon says, I'll be interested in the discussion on the opposite perspective. Should we emulate? Sometimes there is a guilt associated with being derivative, but I think everything is derivative on some level. I would 100% agree. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun, as they say, right? There's like the notion that like you're coming up with something completely original is misguided in a lot of cases. Yeah. The idea that like emulation or influence, you know, like influence is how everything works, right? There's a degree of influence. Some of it's conscious, some of it's subconscious. And like the whole, I'm going to switch this share back to the keynote here. The share, the component of like being influenced by somebody, I think is like, I don't think you can escape it. I think like the first thought that pops in my mind is, you know, when you like read a band on Spotify or you see like a band being interviewed or a singer being interviewed, it's like they're always like, these three people are the people that influenced me. I was spent 12 hours a day in my bedroom listening to this album and it made me want to make this kind of music. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think, again, from the eye of the person that feels like they're being copied, it's like more often than not, it's a compliment. It's not meant maliciously. And, I think as a person that's starting out, there's like, I'm sure of like the aesthetic that eventually made up Visualized Value is taken from all over the place, right? There's somebody that was doing this. These black and white diagrams exist in textbooks in opposite colors. And I think there's, it's like a pretty deep question. I think there's a lot of different ways to think about it, but like in yourself, when you're building on an idea versus when you're ripping an idea, right? It's like when you're writing an essay, or if when you turn it in, you're like, oh man, am I going to get caught for ripping this like quote out of here? Or have I taken this idea and layered my experience and my perspective on top of it, made it different or better, or given it like a different perspective or a different spin on it. So I think that signal that you're talking about, feeling, is definitely something to pay attention to, but like your intention is the most important thing. I think if your desire is to honestly just to get better at something, then there is nothing wrong with it. And on all the platforms that you would publish it on, you have the option to say, influenced heavily by this, right? Like I was inspired by this and this is why I made this thing, while you pursue the thing that, you ultimately want to end up doing. So I think it's about intent. Like if you know that something is malicious or you feel uneasy about it, then you're not going to feel good about publishing it. So you just like, there's a lot of gut that comes into this stuff as well.
I think the crediting thing is a really powerful tool. Like,
and it works to your advantage most of the time as well.
You end up getting the attention of the person that you've either been inspired by, or you're following their playbook or whatever it is. So you not only feel better about yourself, like crediting where the inspiration came from, but you might also have the advantage of interacting with that person and getting it shared out or whatever it is. But it often works to make your own guilt go away and hopefully benefit and get more eyeballs on whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah. Danny, quick answer for that. We have obviously the consumer stuff. So this membership, the How to Visualize Value course, And on the B2B side, we do design consulting. So help people visualize their value proposition, pitch decks, websites, sales materials, stuff like that. So Danny's next question is, can you talk about naming your business, i.e. using your personal brand versus real name versus using a third-party name? How much does naming matter as it relates to influence, audience, etc.? Your goal is to sell products, productized services, etc. So great question. I think like so much of this is dependent on your understanding of who your buyer is and how your industry operates. So the world that we were in, or still are, like very, like we have one foot in this world of corporate advertising. Me as Jack Butcher is not going into Fortune 500 company X and landing a 6-figure contract. It's never going to happen. So again, like everything else, there's a perception thing that plays more effectively in that world. So you have the website, you have the LLC, the New York address, like we have an office on Broadway. That's how you get corporate gigs, right? If you're like, our desire was to like stop going down that route. So I think visualized value comes obviously as influenced by my time in like advertising agencies, branding, et cetera, like that stuff is important. I think there are all of these subtle visual signals that you analyze as a consumer when you're trying to validate the legitimacy of something. So I think there's a real advantage to having like visual chops on your side. It's like, you know, it's a very persuasive skill set. So one of the reasons I started it outside of, I didn't have a personal brand, I wouldn't say, when we started it, right? So it's just, you have your personal Instagram account, personal Facebook account. And I started posting the visualized value stuff to my Instagram, and it just, nobody cared, right? These are kids I went to school with and people I work with, and like, just sort of like, what is this? Like, where are the pictures from, you know, your weekend, you know, trip to wherever? No one was interested. So it was like, oh man, I could either like create another profile for myself and start posting this stuff, or you just give the thing a name, give the project a name, start publishing work under the project name. And then when the project picks up, you connect the project to yourself. So that's one way to do it, is create something that doesn't rely on you. It depends on how closely aligned what you're doing is with the audience you already have. And for me, it was not whatsoever. So there was no benefit to leveraging the old audience to build this project. There was every benefit to creating this thing, making it look bigger and better and prettier and everything else than it was, building that up and then saying, hey, I did this, here's my thing. And then you're starting to align your personal audience more closely with like the types of people that are consuming your work. So that's the order in which we went. And then I think this is total I think up until a certain size, selling services expensively hurts you as an individual. My gut take, right? It's like you're trying to sell a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 project to someone. As an individual, it's like that seems like, regardless of whether it's just you that's fulfilling it, the idea that you have a like entity that represents this process and this result, I think settles a lot of people's perception issues, and like how much bandwidth do these people have, how many people they employ, all of that stuff. So on the service side, like, again, there may be somebody that has a different perspective on this, but we've seen the most success on the service side with a brand that we, you know, are like ambassadors of or employees or directors of, versus, you know, going out and trying to sell really expensive service work to businesses as an individual. I think unless you're, you know, forget the name, like a photographer or something like that that's charging $100,000 a day, a celebrity that's getting, you know, until you have the reputation, the brand is a more trustworthy vehicle, or more, you know, you could put more
it gives it like there's
more legitimacy,
perception behind it of like a desk, or that you have like a whole team of people.
You could create an asset out of thin air, right? You can't create an asset out of thin air for your personal brand. You have to build it up over a long time. Let me know if that helps, Danny. That's a good question, though. There's a lot to talk about there. Agree with that, Alex? I think that's true. Yeah, Karam, that I'd never heard that Tim Ferriss said that, but that makes total sense. One of the things that, sorry, yeah. So Karam asks, Tim Ferriss explained that sharing your playbook is an asymmetric bet. No downside if you'll out execute, huge upside when people succeed and attribute it to you. Brilliant. Obviously, Tim Ferriss has sold a lot of books because he's a phenomenal writer. That makes total sense. Every single like mentor or person that we have like, you know, aligned with the philosophy of, it's like, man, I can't believe this person is telling you all this stuff for nothing, because 99.9% of people will never, ever, ever execute the stuff they're reading. And like, even with what we do here, like the majority of the stuff that we have in this community, with the exception of these calls and the Slack, the content exists, right? In some order around the internet. You could piece it together, and like so much of the value created is just the way you sort of package it up. And the more stuff you put into the outside world and the more you share that stuff, you create this like, you create this perception of like, yeah, this is going to sound cynical, but like if somebody's putting all of this stuff out for free, what is behind the paywall, right? Like I think a lot of people like try and build the brand without sharing the secret sauce, as it were. And again, like we're not talking about developing vaccines here. We're talking about doing things that we're better at than other people that aren't, you know, heavily like regulated industries per se. So like I totally agree with that idea. And as a marketing vehicle, like people sit around thinking about marketing campaigns and worry about how do I talk about this? Like just turn your screen share on and show people what you're capable of and what you do here, and here, and people be lining up to either pay you to do it for them or to learn from you how to do it themselves. So like that I think is one of the biggest shortcuts that people can like implement as a way to grow what you're doing, is just share what you're doing. Like you all like, and the out execute thing is an important part, but I think the people who reach that realization are executors, right? There's a certain amount of confidence in putting out the playbook because you've already deployed it, you've already proven it, and you're working on the next chapter of the book. Good stuff. Yeah, Tim Ferriss, another one. I don't think of competition because I always aim to create a category of one. Yeah, like I think these obviously stratospheric success at that level, but there is just no comparison at that point, right? There's just, you're buying into the person, there's a great David Perel concept, the personal monopoly, where you're just known as the person that does that thing. And while like emulating someone can get you from 0 to 1, right? To get from 1 to 10, you have to like pick a fork, pick a path, and go in a different direction. And there you go, Peter Thiel, classic. Competition is for losers. Yeah, I think like, yeah, I first read that quote and I was like, what on earth does that mean? But yeah, there's a lot of truth in it. It's just very hard to see while you're, while you're not following the things that are intrinsically interesting to you. We were in this hole for years and years, just like, what can we make money doing? What do people want? Man, let's build, what are we doing? We're going to do like recruiting agency websites. It's like, we're walking around the park, like, yeah, let's do this. That'll be our thing. We'll do that. And I couldn't do that for a morning, right? Because honestly, but you come up with the most irrational things because you think you know, if I can only just find something that no one else is doing, the irony is like there is somebody in the world that will love building recruiting websites and they're going to beat you. Like that's the problem. Even if you come up with a great idea that nobody else is doing, like there's somebody out there who's doing it because they love to do it. Man, it's a really hard equation. Like there's another great quote. Scott Galloway says, the people telling you to follow your passion are already rich. And like, that's true because they've probably found something that accelerated them to that point, right? That they could stick with, that there's like this sustainable nature to it. And you could just wake up and do it, while the people that are competing against you are like dragging themselves into work to compete with you. So like that's something that, you know, I mean, the ultimate goal, I think, of what we're doing here is try and get people closer to that thing. And the way that we're trying to do it is just to explain that we went through a bunch of stuff that we really hated doing before doing that. And I don't know if there's a way around that. Somebody let me know if you found it, but like it's a process of elimination as much as it is a like follow your curiosity and, you know, do the things you love. But the beautiful thing is you can build these things in parallel that are seemingly, you know, unmonetizable. Like the first thing I thought of for Visualize Value was like, oh, maybe we'll make a couple $100 a month selling these prints, right? With a 3% margin on these canvases that are going around the world. And never ever thought that, you know, this would translate into something bigger than the business that we had at the time, which was a corporate advertising agency. Now we get requests from corporate requests. And we're like, should we do it? Like they're still lucrative. And like, obviously, you know, there's a difficult debate that goes on, but a year ago it was no brainer. Let's do it. Now it's like, oh, well, we've got options now. We've been putting the time into this thing and it's gotten to a point where there's enough momentum behind it where it can support what we're doing, what we want to do. Justin asks, how much of your take on this topic and others is intrinsic versus taught by experience? My thesis is a lot of people would say it's coming from your experience, but there's an intrinsic thing that you and Celia are aspiring into the meta thing, and that instinct to spiral into the meta thing is intrinsic, perhaps. Yeah, I think so. I think there's little bits that you pick up from different places. I think it's definitely a combination of experience, and it's definitely like, we talked about this the other day. There are things that you get exposed to that at the time of exposure, you don't realize are like formative or, you know, incredibly valuable in the eyes of people that haven't experienced that. And like, I'm not talking about like financial or like status things. It's just like the things that you've experienced that no one else has experienced, or the things that you've been able to do sustainably that other people don't want to do or aren't interested in doing. And like, I think one of the things that always occurred one of the biggest barriers to overcome is like offering less, right? I think that was a big breakthrough, is like, man, you mean I could just do the thing that like I'm interested in doing and not sort of like fluff it out with stuff that I think you want? That was like the biggest breakthrough, is like, and obviously that didn't exist as a product when we started, but like creating, like building up a business and a brand around only the things that you're interested in doing, as opposed to like just bundling in a bunch of stuff that you don't like and then ending up with this like kind of enjoyable thing. But that I mean, I think you cannot discount experience. Like there's no way, I don't think, that this is like where it is, or the you know, the resonance that comes with this stuff from, I don't know, what, 20,000 hours of like doing stuff you're not really that interested in doing, but like some drive there, like design and working in a competitive environment. Like I don't know if I liked it, but I was definitely good at it.
Yeah, I think a lot of this has come from experience, or it's easier to pinpoint where we've gotten to based on experiences. But I think throughout all of these experiences, both good and bad, there have been strong instincts and feelings that we've not so easily, but definitely ignored because we thought that the experience was more valuable than like what our gut was saying, or we weren't in the luxurious position that we're in now to listen to those instincts. Maybe we would have gotten here faster if we did, but we felt like we had to chase certain monetary goals, or we had to chase the status shiny thing of some of these fancy named clients. So we didn't necessarily listen to those instincts. I think that those have always been there, and like the intrinsic guide has been trying to show its way, but we've sometimes leaned too heavily on the experience side.
Yeah, I think if you like back yourself 5 years earlier, it would have happened. The same thing would have happened. It's just like, but is that a product of experience getting to the point where you back yourself?
It's like chicken or the egg.
Yeah, there's like, if somebody had the answer to this, then none of us would be on this phone call right now, right? It's just like, there's definitely this leap of faith that occurs that in some cases is way riskier. And to do another, like to bring up another Tim Ferriss quote, there's this one thing that I read from him that, and I haven't read a ton of his stuff, but I think it was like, how bad could it get, or how bad could it be? So like, you're just like, if you actually like look at the downside, and like, if you were to go after and pursue something fully, and for me, like, I was in a very fortunate position, had a network of people, had a client that had signed on for our new business. So like, the downside to go and all in on our own thing a couple of years ago was like, yeah, it was risky, but it's not like, you know, we're not missing meals or anything like that. So it's definitely, that definitely comes into it. That definitely comes into it. I'm not going to say like, you know, go and quit and do the exact, like, just go after it. And I know a lot of people would give that advice, but so much of it is like setting yourself up in a way that you can experiment with like low risk on the side. One thing I will say about that though is occupying these two mindsets is very different. I think there are projects that we started when we still had corporate jobs where they can kind of play out, right? That you can let them die a death, and the addiction to the salary just allows you to let that fade away. And I think we could do a whole nother topic on this, but your worldview as a business owner is a little different than your worldview as an employee. So when you're trying to do both of those things at the same time, it's difficult to switch between those two models. If that resonates with anyone, I'd love to talk more to you about it, because I've like been thinking about this a little bit over the last couple of weeks. When you're in that position, you don't realize it, but when you get out of it, you're like, now I see why. Like, I even look back at like how I behaved as an employee, and I'm like, man, I really didn't respect the risk that my old, you know, the founders of the businesses I worked for took. I just completely took that for granted that you know, someone had started a business in a garage and grown it to a 13,000 person company. You just had like, I don't know, it's like how I grew up or what I was taught as a kid. And you just I didn't respect it in the same way I do now. When you're in that position yourself and you have to do what it takes to, you know, make sure all the lights stay on, then you respect it more. Yeah, we'll definitely do that in the car. Beautiful. All right, we went over here. Sorry about that. But this was fun. Hopefully this was a good topic, and would love any feedback you have, any additional questions, whack them in the Slack, and we will get to them. This was fun, though. Thank you, guys. Much appreciated. You. Have a lovely evening, morning, afternoon, day, wherever you are. Good night, good night, good night.